universe expands, yet the truth remains, still within.
What if you were never what you thought? There is something about your experience that feels undeniable. A sense of being someone, a sense of identity. You wake up every day knowing who you are, carrying your name, your memories, your story. It feels continuous, stable, real, as if there is a core you behind everything, something that remains the same no matter what happens. But if you look closely, that sense of self begins to shift, because everything you associate with you can change. Your thoughts change constantly, appearing and disappearing without your control. Your emotions rise and fall, sometimes without warning. Even your personality evolves over time, shaped by experiences, environment, and memory. The person you were years ago is not the same person you are now, and yet something feels the same. There is a continuity that doesn't seem to belong to your thoughts, your emotions, or your story. A quiet presence that has been there through all of it, not changing, not evolving, not growing in the same way everything else does, just present. But what is that? Because if everything you identify with can change, then what exactly is it that remains? What is it that experiences the changes without being reduced to them? What is it that observes your thoughts, your emotions, your life, without being any of those things? This is where the idea of identity begins to break down. Because the more you try to define yourself, the more you realize that every definition points to something that can be observed, and anything that can be observed cannot be the observer. You can observe your thoughts, you can observe your emotions, you can even observe your sense of self. So what does that leave? Because if the you believe you are is something that can be seen, felt, or described, then it exists as part of your experience. And if it exists within your experience, then it is something that appears. And anything that appears is not fundamental. It is temporary. And yet, there is something that is not temporary, something that does not appear and disappear, something that does not change with time, something that does not depend on memory or identity. Awareness, not as a concept, not as an idea, but as the simple fact that experience is happening. And this is where everything begins to shift. Because if what you are is not the content of your experience, but the awareness of it, then your identity is not fixed. It is not limited to a name, a story, or a body. It is something more subtle, more difficult to define, and yet more constant than anything else, which leads to a deeper question. If you are awareness, why does it feel like you are a person? Why does it feel localized, centered, limited to a single point of view? Why does it feel like you are inside your body, looking out at the world, instead of the other way around? Because if awareness is not limited in itself, then something must be creating that sense of limitation. And maybe that limitation is not a mistake. Maybe it is what makes experience possible. Because without limitation, there would be no perspective, no individuality, no distinction between self and other. There would be no way to experience anything as something separate. Everything would exist without contrast, without boundaries, without form, and without form, there is no experience. So what if the self you feel is not who you are, but how you experience? A temporary structure that allows awareness to take a shape, to interact, to observe from a specific point of view, not the source, but the expression. In that sense, your identity is not false, but it is not complete. It is a layer, a perspective, a way of seeing, and beneath it, there is something that has always been there, not defined, not limited, not separate, just aware. So maybe the question is not, who am I? But something deeper. What is it that is aware of this question right now? If this made you think, take a moment to like the video and tell me in the comments, do you think you are your identity or something beyond it?